Right, so that little section in the Epistle of John introduces us to an interesting subject, which is going to be found a number of times in this first epistle and once in the second epistle of John, and that is this subject of Antichrist. So this is a subject where there's a lot written about the Antichrist and who or what the Antichrist might be. So tonight I'm going to give you what my take is on it. It's perhaps maybe not what is, we might say, the traditional view of the Antichrist. But anyway, we're going to look at it, and I'm going to hopefully share some things with you that might be helpful. So first of all, can everyone see that? Do you know what this here is? It's a blank piece of paper. So that's what we want to do when we're coming to the subject of the Antichrist, because, as I said, there's lots written on it, and this is kind of, you know, what you might call the usual suspects. What you find, one of the original first recognized people which was deemed to be the Antichrist was suggested to be Nostradamus, the false prophet. It was suggested to be, you know, the Caesars of the Roman Empire, who were worshipped as gods, and then obviously identification with the papacy. So these are kind of what you might call usual suspects. There's a lot of writing on this in regards to the Antichrist, and there's been hundreds of them. There's, you know, like from Vespasian, Nero, Muhammad, Constantine, the popes, Martin Luther, Napoleon Bonaparte, Abraham Lincoln, Adolf Hitler, Ronald Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev, Saddam Hussein, even recently Obama was said, you know, that this was the Antichrist. And then after Obama, of course, there was Donald Trump, and there was lots of writing about Donald Trump. So in more recent times, these two figures are probably the biggest candidates that have been written about as being the Antichrist. Then you have sort of other characters like this, and this is an interesting sort of picture, actually, because this is actually the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, one of the leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church, talking to Putin and suggesting that if they didn't defy the ban that was placed on them on having Easter celebration, Easter Mass, then it would give rise to the Antichrist. So there's a little bit of an irony there, is that here, you know, some of these people that are deemed to be the prime candidates for being the Antichrist, talking about, you know, if they're not given to freedom to worship, then the Antichrist will arise. So in looking at this subject, you know, like the phrase Antichrist just means exactly what it says. And we know all about things that are anti these days, because we've got lots of movements going on, haven't we? Anti-vax movements, anti-lockdown movements, well, right close to home. So we understand this concept of, you know, a movement that is opposed to something. So in the Epistle of John, we are introduced to this subject of Antichrist, or anti-Messiah, as it should be. And what's interesting is that, as I said, we want to start with a blank piece of paper. So I want you to try, if you can, if you have an opinion on the Antichrist and you have a thought about it, just to try, just for tonight, to start with this blank piece of paper, just to put it aside, just to wipe the slate clean, and let's start with a blank piece of paper. So I've got a little exercise for you to start with, which you can do in your bubbles. And it's kind of easy, really, because the phrase Antichrist only appears 4 times in the whole of the Bible, and that's the 4 times right there. Twice in this chapter or this section that we're just reading, once in chapter 4 of 1 John, and then once again in 2 John chapter 1. So what I'd like you to do is just in your bubbles go and look at those verses and then see what John says about the Antichrist. What are the points of identification, and then put them into the speech box, or even if you'd like to turn on your mic, that's fine, and just say what you can see there about the Antichrist. Let's just take a couple of minutes, shouldn't take you long. Any points of identification yet?
There are many antichrists.
Yeah, so there's the first one, is that often, you know, like we see this concept of there being the Antichrist. But right from the start, John says, well, there's lots of Antichrists, which is interesting.
And they went out from the believers.
Yes, so that's interesting, isn't it? So these Antichrists were a part of the believers in the first century that John was talking to and left. They went out.
He's not necessarily a world leader.
No, nothing in any of these verses which suggests that. So yes, Robert's just adding to what Ray said, or Robert or Sharon, that he has come but is coming. So he's both come, but he's coming, which is very true.
The Antichrist is he who denies the Father and the Son.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, isn't it? So one of the key things is about the teaching. It's about the denial of the Father and the Son.
He's
and is there anything in particular? Sorry?
He's not necessarily a person.
No, it can be a system.
A system? Yeah. A teaching? A spirit?
And he doesn't acknowledge that Jesus came in the flesh.
He doesn't acknowledge that Jesus came in the flesh. Now, that's a real key point. So there's something about the denial of the Father and Son, and it's about the denial that Jesus came in the flesh. That's a real key point that it brings up twice, but particularly in that latter part in 1 John chapter 4. So that's good. That's we've got a little bit of a background of what, you know, John says about the Antichrist. And the reason why I wanted to start with a blank sheet of paper is because part of the issue we have with this teaching of the Antichrist is that there is a lot of effort going to link, for instance, other parts of the Bible, like, for instance, the beast in Revelation, or there's something in 2 Peter that talks about the man of sin, or there's talk about a king of fierce countenance in Daniel. And there's a lot of effort to try to link these phrases or these subjects with the Antichrist. What I want to suggest to you is that there are some unique things about the subject of Antichrist in John's Gospel, which I don't think are quite the same with those other subjects. In particular, that this group of people who were Antichrist were very much a part of the believers. They came out from the believers. So that's pretty important in terms of John's Gospel. So let's just go and have a quick look at perhaps a little bit of context in John's Gospel. You've heard about Wayne's World. Well, sorry, this is John's World. So yes, so the subject of the world is what leads to it. And Justin did a brilliant talk last week. Those verses which leads into the subject of Antichrist starts from verse 15, which says, and we know these verses really well, don't love the world or anything that's in the world. If anyone loves the world, he doesn't love the Father. For all the things in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, pride of life, and so on. So this is what leads to the subject of Antichrist. Now here's something interesting. This phrase, the world, or in the Greek, cosmos, which we should be familiar with, the idea of cosmopolitan comes from that. It appears in the Bible, in the New Testament, 187 times in the New Testament. Did you know that over 50%, in fact 55% of the times it appears is in the Gospel of John and in 1 John that we're reading? In this little tiny section that we're reading in 1 John, this phrase appears 23 times. In John's Gospel, it appears 79 times, making a total of, what's that, 122. 122 times out of 187, this phrase appears in John's Gospel. So what I've got there is a few verses, and again, you can look up those verses quickly. I'll give you another couple of minutes. Just look up those verses and see if you can see the way John uses this phrase, the world. And you'll see it in some of these verses that are there. And we're going to come back to the first one. So any comments again, if you want to jump on and just make any comments about how John seems to be using these phrases, the world. We kind of see the world as being, you know, the planet, like on the picture. But is that the way John uses it? I've just randomly picked some of those verses. They're just interesting in their context in John's Gospel.
Well, 6 verse 7, the world cannot hate me, is obviously not talking about the planet. It's talking about something else.
Yep, and what about the one that I've got there, 6 verse 14? So there's another one. So if you look at those verses that you can see on the screen and just check with those. So speaking about Jesus, it talks about that he is the prophet who was going to come into the world. Seems to be a world full of people. Yeah.
You think he's talking about the Jewish world?
Yeah, I think that's the point. As you go through here, some of these quotes, you know, in fact, all of these quotes, if you look carefully, you know, this was, you know, the John 6, this was the prophecy of Moses that one would come to the nation of Israel. The prophet, he would come into the world. The first one, for instance, John 1 verse 10 and 11 is probably the key quote. It says, you know, the worlds were made by him, but the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own did not know him. His own did not receive him. So the context in John chapter 1, it's talking about Israel. When it's talking about the world, it links it to his own people. So there's other quotes as well. So like this one here is a good one. John chapter 12, verse 31. Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. And then again, in John chapter 14 and verse 30, he says, I'm not going to talk much with you, for the ruler of this world is coming, and he has no claim on me. So you see this thing where Jesus says the ruler of the world's coming. And obviously in John chapter 14, he was in the upper room and he was about to be arrested and taken by the Jewish leaders. And he said, you know, when he was lifted up, And when he was going to be sacrificed, it would bring judgment upon the world. See, we get quotes like this, don't we? Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words shall never pass away. So when we think about this concept of the world, or in Matthew's gospel, heaven and earth, we see this concept of the Jewish heavens and the Jewish earth, the Jewish world. And when you're looking at John's gospel all the way through, you can follow that theme and you'll see that that's what it's talking about. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that it's no different in the Epistle of John. And that's the key as you come into this subject of the Antichrist. And this is another quote here, just in Peter, where it talks about the sinful world being destroyed. Nevertheless, we are waiting for a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. And without again going into it, I believe Peter is talking about events which were about to take place in AD 70. The Jewish world, the Jewish heavens, the Jewish earth were about to pass away. And it says, you know, in another quote, they'll be rolled up like a scroll. It's just going to pass away. Now, when you come to the Epistle of John, and we start in this section, you'll see that that's what he says. So let's now look at this section a little bit closer. So coming to the Epistle of John, that's 1 John chapter 2, and he says that, children, it is the last hour, and you've heard Antichrist is coming. So now many Antichrists have come. Now I've missed what I was looking for. He talks in the same subject about the world passing away, or these things passing away. 17? Oh, yeah, sorry, leading into it. Sorry, this was our context into Antichrist. So verse 17, he says, as he's coming into the subject of Antichrist, he says the world is passing away along with its desires. So that's how he starts the subject, is the world is passing away, which is what he prophesied was going to happen. The Jewish world was about to pass away. And so now he comes to the subject of the Antichrist. So let's have a look and see if we can identify again this subject. What does he mean that this subject of the Antichrist is a teaching in John chapter 4, verse 2, which says, and this you know, the Spirit of God, every spirit that does not confess that Jesus come in the flesh, every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is of God. Every spirit that does not confess Jesus came in the flesh is not of God. So here's this concept of the fact that, you know, you want to know what Antichrist is, it's easy. Every spirit that does not confess Jesus Christ came in the flesh. Now, years ago, you know, I was taught that this was the essence of proving the Trinity wrong, that John was talking about people that believed that Jesus Christ was a spirit and didn't come in bodily form, and that Jesus was not human like we are, and that's the doctrine of the Trinity, and John is opposing the doctrine of the Trinity. I have to say that I don't think in the context that this is the subject that John is dealing with. And I just want you, as we'll look at it a bit closer, but this is a busy slide. But when you go through John's gospel and John's epistle, you'll find that over and over again, almost all the phrases in John's epistle come from the gospel. They're all the same. He uses the same concepts. He elaborates on the same language. So when you look at, say, the beginning of the gospel and you compare it with the epistle, what we're just reading now in John chapter 2, there's remarkable similarities. So in John chapter 1, it says, "This is the true light which gives light to everyone coming into the world. He was in the world and the world didn't know him. And through him, yet the world was not known by him." And as we just read in John chapter 1, verse 2, the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. In John 1, verse 10, it says, "He came to his own and his own didn't receive him." In what we just read in 1 John 2, it says, "They went out from us. They were not of us. If they had been from us, they would have continued with us, but they went out, that it might be plain that they were not of us. He came to his own and his own didn't receive him." It's the same language. The next part, "All who did receive them, to them he gave power to become sons of God, not born of the flesh, but born of the Spirit." In verse 29 of 1 John chapter 2, it says, "I know that he is righteous. You may be sure that everyone who practices righteousness is born of him," is born again, born of the Spirit. That phrase there, "You've seen his glory, the glory of the only Son and of the Father." So it makes this connection. "He that has seen me has seen the Father. Whoever denies the Son denies the Father," it says in this epistle. Now, this is just an example, but as you go through, you'll see it's very much the same. So here's this thing. What did it mean when it says every spirit that does not confess that Jesus Christ came in the flesh? So John's epistle starts and says, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, which we have handled, and which we have touched, the word of life." So John's epistle starts with the fact that this is the man who came that we heard, we saw, we physically handled and touched him. And when you go to the the gospel, you get phrases like this in John chapter 20. "Reach forth your finger, Thomas. Behold my hands. Thrust it into my side. Touch me," he said. "Don't be faithless, be believing." And then we get quotes like this in Luke. "See my hands and my feet. It is me. Touch me. Feel me. A spirit does not have flesh and blood, as you have seen." In all of these occasions, it's talking about Jesus when he rose from the dead. When Jesus rose from the dead, he physically appeared before the disciples and he put out his hands for them to touch, to feel, and to handle as clear proof evidence that he was risen from the dead. Because in Psalm chapter 16, it says these words, "You will not abandon my body, my soul, to Sheol, to the grave, nor will you let your Holy One see corruption." And in Acts chapter 2, Peter picks up this quote from Psalm 16, and what he shows is that in fulfillment of this verse in Psalm 16, Jesus became the Christ. He became the Messiah. He says, "This Lord," in Acts chapter 2 and verse 27, "this Jesus who you crucified has become both Lord and Christ." And he says in verse 31, "For you would not abandon my soul to Hades, nor leave your Holy One to see corruption." And in verse 31 of Acts 2, he says, "He foresaw and spoke of the resurrection of Christ." So we're almost there to getting the key to this understanding. So come back with me just for a moment to John chapter 20, where we were just looking with Thomas. So when Jesus says to Thomas, touch me, see, handle me, as it says in Luke, because a spirit does not have flesh and bones. He gave them his physical body as evidence of his resurrection. Then it says, verse 30, Jesus did many signs in the presence of disciples which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus is Christ, Messiah. Jesus is the Messiah. This is why this is written. This is why John wrote his gospel. And this means John's audience already believed in a Messiah. I believe John's audience was truly a Jewish audience, and probably Samaritan as well, because John preached in Samaria, and they believed in the coming of Messiah. And for 2,000 years in their history, that vision or that teaching of a Messiah was something distant in the future. It was something that they longed for and waited, that they physically could not see. And then Jesus came. And these things are written, says John, that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ. He's the one. But there were a group of people in John's day who denied that Jesus was the Christ, who denied Jesus was the Messiah. They were Antichrist, and they were Jewish. And Jesus called them the prince of this world. So he goes on to say, be on your alert and warn them in chapter 2 that this was the last hour. He says, children, this is the last hour. It's time. Now, when you go through John's gospel, this is again a phrase which is used over and over again in John. You remember Jesus used it often, didn't he? When he was at the wedding feast in Cana, and his mother came to him and said, they've run out of wine, Jesus said, woman, what have I to do with you? My hour is not yet come. And again in John chapter 11, when they went to see Lazarus, he says, my hour is not yet come. But when he came to John chapter 13, it says, now when the feast of Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of the world, having loved his own that were in the world, he loved them unto the end. So when the hour came, and I've got a little quote there you'll see out of Psalms, my times are in your hand. And the reason why I've got that quote in there is because this is the Psalm that has the last words of Jesus from the cross. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. When Jesus' hour was come, he had this great confrontation with the prince of this world. The Jewish leaders and the Romans, they aligned themselves against Jesus, and to all intents and purposes, it would appear that they were victorious over Jesus, and they killed him. But Jesus said, if I be lifted up, the prince of this world shall be cast out. This was the Antichrist that Jesus faced in his day. But what he went on to say is this, and I think this is what the story in the Epistle of John's all about. Jesus uses this phrase again for the hour is coming when he starts talking to his disciples about what they're going to face. He says to them, the hour is coming when he that kills you will think he's doing the service of God. And they will do these things because they have not known the Father or me. And in John chapter 16 is this incredible chapter which talks about Jesus encouraging the disciples for what they were going to face. You see, what Jesus faced in AD 30 when they put him to death and crucified, the disciples were going to face in AD 70. There was a massive persecution that came under Nero's time, a huge persecution on all the Christians. Thousands of them lost their lives, and they became anti-Christ and anti-Christians, anti his followers. So what happened to Jesus was going to happen to the disciples. And in John's gospel, in chapter 16, he says, I'm going to give you something special to get you through it. I'm going to send you a comforter, and he's going to give you the strength to endure. And he will be the Spirit of truth, and he will guide you into all truth. Now, when you come back to look at this again, epistle of John in chapter 2, where we're reading, look at the context here. Verse 20, straight after he talks about these antichrists, he says, but you have been anointed by the Holy One. That's the same phrase as he's using about sending the Comforter. You have been anointed by the Holy One, and you have knowledge. He will guide you into all truth. I write to you because you do not know, not because you don't know the truth, but because you know it. Who is a liar but he that denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, the one who denies the Father and Son. No one who denies the Son has the Father. Whoso confesses the Son has the Father. Let what you have heard at the beginning abide in you. Those are all phrases out of John chapter 16. I and my Father will dwell with you. We will abide with you. All the language in John chapter 15 and 16 are found in this section. This was the promise that Jesus gave his disciples, that he was going to encourage and strengthen them when they faced the most difficult challenge they would ever face in their life. And he was going to give them the Spirit of the Comforter to lead them into all truth, and to able to stand when they would make their defense. So that is a little bit of the background here to the Antichrist. You know, there's only two positions we can have. We can either be protesters for or against. We can either be advocates for Christ, like the woman on the right. Good news, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. Or you can be like the guy on the left. If Jesus returns, kill him again. There's hatred out there still towards Christ and his followers. And there really is no middle ground, isn't there? Because Jesus said, whoever is not with me, he's against me. And whoever does not gather with me, he scatters. See, the only thing you get from sitting on the fence is splinters. There's no room to sit on the fence. And Jesus here, John here is really trying to encourage the disciples because they were about to face persecution. It's an elaboration on Jesus' words in the gospel. It's an elaboration on his words at the Last Supper. And here John is taking this group of fragile believers and he's trying to encourage them. And when you think about it, why did people leave? You know, they'd obviously started off as part of the believers, but then they had given up. And where did they go? Well, they obviously went back to Judaism. They turned back to the law. And this is the subject again of a lot of the writings of Paul's. They turned back and they crucified the Son of God afresh by doing so. They turned back to Moses. And John here gives you the recipe for staying in the fold, for staying pro-Christ, positive Christ, promoters of Christ. Because when you think about when Jesus was crucified and put to death, the disciples were in a very fragile state. They were scattered. You know, there was poor Thomas. He was not sure where he stood. All of a sudden, his world had come down. Think of poor Mary Magdalene. She who had been so close to Jesus, she was beside herself. She was so distressed. Think about Peter. He had denied Jesus. The concept of facing Jesus again with the guilt that he must have been experiencing was huge. John, the disciple, he said he was as loyal as the guy that was prepared to bring fire down from heaven on the Samaritans. All of these disciples were very fragile. And when Jesus came back in the midst of them, someone had to go get Thomas. Jesus commissioned Mary to go back to the disciples. She became the glue. He sat down with Peter and he said to him, when you're converted, strengthen my brethren, feed my lambs, commissioned him with this role as a true pastor and true shepherd. And the point in all of these examples that Jesus uses in his gospel is you want to avoid becoming a fence sitter or becoming Antichrist, then we need to be belonging in our community. We need to feel that this community is what our lives are truly about. Because there is persecution, isn't there? We haven't really seen it in the Western world, but it's happening. And, you know, I guess I had a little taste of it a few years ago. Well, what's happening at the moment in Afghanistan is there's thousands of Christians who are in underground churches and hiding for their lives. We have our own brothers and sisters there who are downloading a Bible app every day and then deleting it, doing their reading on a Bible app and then deleting it straight away, because they know if the Taliban come in and they find that Bible app on their phone, that they'll be killed. And some of them already have. Because we're living in the last hour. And it is the last hour, it is the last time. And who's to know, you know, what persecution or trials we may face in the future. But John's example is that the key to being able to endure, it's love, isn't it? A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another. And he emphasizes and re-emphasizes what's there in the gospel record. So that's a little bit of a background in terms of, you know, the way I see the Antichrist in John's gospel. I believe it was a group of Jews that were very much a part of the early Christian movement that came from the priesthood. Many priests and Levites joined in with the community when it first started, but then the pressure that came upon them from the Orthodox Jews caused them to actually turn away and turn their back. And then they became persecutors, and they became persecutors of that faithful first century. And when Nero began his persecution, history says that it was actually the Jewish administration within his office that suggested to blame the burning of Rome upon the Christians, and so set about this persecution, which went throughout the whole of the Roman Empire to all 10 provinces. Thousands of Christians lost their life. but in the end, he that lost his life would save it. And so finally, just reading that last section from verse 28, and now little children, abide in him, so that when he appears, we may have confidence and not shrink from him in shame of his coming. If you know that he is righteous, you may be sure that everyone who practices righteousness shall be born of him. Thank you.